The 2023 season of college football has seen a lot of spectacular games. We've seen many big games like Oregon versus Washington, Michigan versus Georgia, Texas versus Oklahoma, and Alabama versus Georgia. I mean, the list doesn't stop there. But with the 2023 season coming to an end and college football going into bowl season, I wanted to talk about the best game from each week of college football this year and give my opinion for which game I thought was the biggest game of each week and that lived up to the hype. But I also want to pick the best game of the year up to conference championship week. So I will be ranking these teams off of two things: how much playoff implications they had, and also how good of a game it was. So I will pick one game from each week, then pick the best game of the season. But before I get into this video, here's a reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, because we post daily college football videos. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Now let's start all the way back at week 0, and I'll count this as a week, but there were no games that really mattered, so this is basically just a consolation week, or like an honorable mention spot. But I guess week 0, I'll say the best game was number 6 team at the time, USC, beating San Jose State 56-28. At the very least, there were some fun scoring involved, and USC was ranked 6th at the time, but let's get off of week 0 and actually talk about games that matter, starting at week 1. And for week 1, this spot definitely goes to Florida State versus LSU. The game may not have lived up to the hype it originally had, but this was still a huge game for both these teams, and they both finished in the top 15. And although it was a pretty big deficit, nor the game really compared to the stakes of this game that week. The best game of week 2 definitely goes to the game between Texas and Alabama. That might be the biggest win of the season. Texas going into Tuscaloosa and beating Bama by double digits was a very impressive statement win for them. And it definitely lived up to the hype that game had, because now they are both in the playoffs, and we may actually see a rematch between the two teams in the national championship game this season. And I would love to see that game. It would definitely be history making. The best game of week 3 surprisingly was Colorado versus Colorado State. And you may be saying, wait a minute, why do you have this matchup in week 3? But if you go back and look, there were absolutely no good games that week. And although Colorado was very overhyped, this game still got incredible views, being a night game. And if you hate Deion or love Deion, everybody was watching that game, including me. And this game definitely was amazing. So this definitely was the best game of week 3, just because of how big it was at the time, and also because there were hardly any worthy matchups that week. The best game of week 4 definitely goes to Ohio State versus Notre Dame. It was a top 10 matchup at the time, and although both of these teams didn't do as well as some may expected, this was still a game with a lot on the line, and a heck of a game. It came down to 4th down stops, and who could be more resilient near the end of the game. It was definitely a fun game to watch. It was a very low-scoring defensive battle, and in my opinion, I do think it was ultimately the biggest game of that week. But for week 5, it was really open, and people's opinions may differ. There were multiple top 25 matchups, but no big games with playoff implications or much on the line for both teams playing. But at the very least, I guess I would say LSU versus Ole Miss was the best game of week 5, because it was a fun, high-scoring game, and both these teams finished in the top 15, and Jayden Daniels won the Heisman for LSU. LSU could have been scary this year if they had a solid defense, but they were basically the USC of the SEC, just better than USC. But LSU versus Ole Miss was definitely a very good game. The best game of week 6 definitely goes to the Red River rivalry between Oklahoma and Texas. This game definitely had playoff implications on the line, and if Oklahoma didn't lose 2 games after beating Texas, they very well could be in the playoffs instead of Texas. But not only was this a game with playoff implications, it was a game that was fantastic and had tons of highlight plays on defense and on special teams. And it also had an incredible game-winning drive by quarterback Dillon Gabriel, and Oklahoma won that game. It was one of the better Red River rivalry games of the last 15 years. And that game was also Texas's only loss on the year. The best game of week 7 was by far the first matchup between Oregon and Washington. Some people may consider it the best game of the season. Both quarterbacks played spectacular, and it ultimately ended up being Oregon's only loss on the year, in which they would meet again later, and of course Oregon would lose again. But both of these teams had legitimate cases for the playoffs, and have both won games in different ways. But both are 2 of the best teams in the country. The best game of week 8 goes to Penn State versus Ohio State, and although Penn State let a lot of people down with the performance they had, this was still one of the bigger games of the season. There were some other fun top 25 matchups, but this was definitely the best game, even if it was a boring, sloppy game. Week 9 was a tough one to decide, because if Oregon and Utah wasn't a blowout, it probably would have been them, and it was the game day appearance game, but ultimately Utah didn't finish ranked, and it was a blowout, so I had to consider some other games, And I ended up going with Kansas versus Oklahoma because of how fun of a game it was. And ultimately, that was Oklahoma's first loss on the year. And you could possibly say, if it wasn't for that game, they would have kept their momentum and finished undefeated. Oklahoma had all the momentum going for them after beating Texas, and they ended up playing Kansas in a game with tough weather conditions and a delay and lost it 38-33. And although Oklahoma had 2 losses this year, they were a very good team when they were playing their best game. And they did end up beating Texas, who is now the number 3 ranked team in the country. So I say Week 9's best game probably was Oklahoma versus Kansas. For Week 10, there were so many great matchups, and there were 2 that I really had to toss up, and it was between LSU versus Alabama and Georgia versus Missouri. And if I could, I would pick both of them as a tie, but I'm only picking one from each week, and I'm going to have to give the edge to Alabama versus LSU, because it just had a different vibe to it, and it was Alabama's revenge game, and Alabama and LSU was always a bigger game. I know Georgia versus Missouri was ultimately a top 10 matchup, and Missouri did have a really good breakthrough year, but I had to choose one, and I went with Alabama versus LSU. But any one of those games absolutely makes sense to be the best game of Week 10. For Week 11, you could say there's a debate for another game, but personally, I think most people would agree Michigan versus Penn State was the best all-around game of Week 11. Penn State had a chance to shake things up, but nobody actually thought Penn State was going to win, so it made it not as good as it could have been. But that was Michigan's first test of the season, and they handled it okay, and they won without their head coach. So this game was pretty big, and it had playoff implications and big title race implications. The best game of Week 12 was definitely Washington versus Oregon State, and Oregon State got robbed of getting a game day appearance. Instead, they gave it to James Madison, who was playing Appalachian State that week. But the Washington versus Oregon State game didn't disappoint, and if you think Pac-12 play is all about being pretty and scoring tons of points with no defense, you have to watch this game. This game was a low-scoring slugfest battle. It was 22-20, and Washington showed that they can win in many different circumstances, even if there's heavy rain. But the line of scrimmage battle was very fun to watch. And this game was very underrated in my opinion, and it was a game with Pac-12 title implications on the line, including Washington being undefeated and playing at one of the toughest places to play when they played at Oregon State. And Oregon State hardly loses home games and was ranked 11th at the time. So it was a good win for Washington, and it definitely was the game of the week. And for Week 13, which is the last week before Conference Championship Week, Week 13's best game definitely was Michigan versus Ohio State. Nothing compares to this game, and it was probably the best game of the regular season, or at least it was debatably the best game of the regular season. And is this the greatest rivalry in college football? Let me know down in the comments below. But nothing was much bigger than the number 2 and the number 3 team playing, and it was basically a first-round playoff matchup before the playoffs are even here. We all knew that the team that lost this was most likely not going to be in the playoffs, and ultimately had no shot at the Big Ten championship game. And Ohio State did lose the game and miss out on the playoffs. So this game really had everything on the line, and it was basically a non-official playoff matchup. And what's better than a big game like Michigan versus Ohio State? But to end the video, we now have to talk about Conference Championship Week and pick my best game of the whole season. But for Conference Championship Week, there were 2 amazing games. You could pick Georgia versus Alabama, or you could pick Oregon versus Washington. And I really wish I could pick both, but like I said, I'm only picking one. And I'm sticking to picking one game. And possibly, this game was bigger than Ohio State versus Michigan. And I think the best game of Conference Championship Week was definitely Georgia versus Alabama. And I do have this as the best game of the year. So not only is this the best game of Conference Championship Week, I would definitely say it's the best game of the year. This game was a rematch from the national title 2 years ago, which was the last time they played. But if Georgia won this game, maybe I would have picked Oregon versus Washington, but I did already put Oregon versus Washington on this video, and Alabama beating Georgia really made this game matter even more than it already did. Alabama beat undefeated Georgia, who had won 29 in a row and were back-to-back national champions, and ultimately this was so big of a win that the committee ended up leaving an undefeated Florida State team out for Alabama because of how big of a win it was. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, I didn't agree with the decision to leave Florida State out. But that's my opinion, and I'm not going to keep complaining about it like a lot of people are. I don't think it's that big of a deal. But whether you agree with it or not, Alabama obviously at least had a case, and the committee ultimately put them in, and now they are playing the number 1 team in the country again. And well, let's just say it doesn't end well for number 1 teams when they play Nick Saban, so I'll leave it at that. But anyways, that definitely was bigger than Oregon versus Washington, but there could very well be a debate, and if Georgia won, and there was no chaos that affected anything, I probably might have picked Oregon versus Washington, which was the last ever Pac-12 championship and also the best Pac-12 championship ever. Unfortunately, it just happened to be on the same week as another history-making rematch between Georgia and Alabama, so the edge definitely goes to Georgia versus Alabama. But regardless of everything that has happened, it was a very fun college football season, and it's sad that the season is coming to an end, but I hope everybody enjoys bowl season, and I hope you guys enjoy the 4-team playoff. But I'm very excited for the 12-team playoff and the new era of college football, because it should be very fun and interesting. But that will do it for the video. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and also turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, because we post daily college football videos. Happy holidays, everyone, and peace out.